Well, again, Steve here, and I think it's time to talk a little bit about shit soup. Why would I talk about shit soup? Well, as I may have mentioned before, I usually carry a little notebook with me. I call it my dream catcher. So when things come to me and I try to connect ideas together that might be helpful for myself and maybe, who knows, maybe somebody else. what what are the odds? But maybe I just make a note of them. And then if a discussion point comes about later that I have to share, then I try to, you know, bring those thoughts together into some cohesive manner that might be helpful. So shit is one of those words that's used, a little bit overused actually. That's the shit, man. And but nevertheless, we have, literal shit or physical shit. Most of us have a bit of an aversion to, even slightly to our own for that matter. But I like to use this term that I don't know if I made it up or if I heard it somewhere else, but it's shit soup. And if somebody was to serve you or I shit soup and we knew it was, we would have a great aversion to eating it probably. And the thing is, it wouldn't matter. Well, it would matter to some degree maybe, but it wouldn't matter a lot how much shit was in it. If it was full of shit, or if it even had just a little bit of shit, even if it had all of the greatest ingredients that we love to eat, and the flavors and so on, and even just had, if we had the suspicion even that it had a little bit of shit in it, it would be something we wouldn't want to eat. Why? Because we would perceive it to be, or we would understand it to be corrupted. Completely corrupted. Because soup is liquid, and as soon as you put something in it, that is potentially throughout the whole thing, even if we can't taste it, even if we can't figure it out. If we have the suspicion or the knowledge that there's a little bit of shit in there, that's enough shit to say, nah, I'm not really that hungry. Even if I am, I'll wait till later. This, to me, has a lot to do with intellectual honesty. Because if we're going to attempt to be honest, but yet we deliberately let fly certain ideas in discussion, certainly things within ourselves that are not intellectually honest, then it's like we've just dropped in a little bit of shit into it. And what it does is it contaminates everything else. It has a way of contaminating everything else because we've got to dance around the little bit of shit that we've got in there, right? And this to me is why it's important to live a life of principles, and probably why most civilizations and societies that live according to precepts or even commandments or even like universal stuff, it's not just like it applies to somebody and doesn't apply to somebody else. When that happens, there can be greater degree of success because everybody's playing off the same rule book. It's basically rule of law, like I talked before, right? It becomes like that. One of the things I think which is either the cause or the effect of why society has become so decadent and is basically decaying is because the boomer generation, for whatever reason, decided to give up on precepts that it had. They threw away their religions, and they didn't adopt anything that was anywhere close to the universality of what they had given up. So what they adopted instead are notions like what are these called? Postmodernism, which is this ever shifting sand of subjectivity. It's like it's all your perspective, man. It's like but you have your truth and I have my truth. Well, I have to push back at this because when I get into a discussion with somebody like this now, if I am to say that I'm intellectually honest and I care about the discussion, then when I hear things like that, I have to push back a little bit because it doesn't make any sense to me, and I have to say, hang on. So I was in a discussion with somebody not long ago, and that came up. There was this saying, your truth or your reality and my reality. And then there was also the perception of truth and I are reality. And my point, to boil it right down, was along the lines of reality doesn't care about our perception. It doesn't seem to care. I mean, I used the example that I'd heard somewhere before too, whereas if we're in a desert, right? We're really hungry. We're really thirsty, rather. We're dying of thirst. We're parched. And all of a sudden, yay, we see in the distance this shimmering lake. Beautiful, looks beautiful. We're going to walk over there, get our fill of water. As we walk over there, it keeps moving away from us. And then we realize it's a mirage. It's not actually a lake. Our perception was that the reality is there was a lake there. But reality didn't care about our perception. Reality tells us that there was not a lake there. And you know, it's interesting to look at people today, especially, in how they justify their actions, which is that this old morality and so on that we used to have was so outdated, man, it's so old-fashioned and all that, yet it held society together. There was a glue because everybody understood what was considered to be right and wrong. It's not necessarily that I'm going to say that we get 100% to perfection in terms of what are the best, necessarily the best ethics to live by, but there are ethics that work better than others. And I do think that there is a way to, philosophically, to arrive at universal ethics. But I also understand pragmatically that most people are not going to arrive that way, and therefore, you know, older versions of adopting, you know, constitutional precepts and so on have their value in keeping people on a level playing field. Okay, I'm only going to act based on reference to the precept. And if my precept says I'm not supposed to lie, then I'm not going to lie. If my precept says that I'm not supposed to steal, then I'm going to also infer that I'm not going to get somebody else called a politician to steal for me and give to me, because that's also wrong. The stealing doesn't say, oh, I can't steal, but I can hire somebody else to steal for me. You know. So, and once we dispose of precepts, then what, you know, nature hoards a vacuum. Then what comes in there, if we don't deliberately set out to replace it with something else, then it's just going to get filled up with some decision-making process. And the problem with us humans is that we are fundamentally, you know, as individuals, we are human and we are animal. But what distinguishes us, we're not just animals, we're humanoid animals, which means that we have the ability to reason and the ability to come up with concepts of right and wrong. An animal, although they do operate on right and wrong, because, you know, if they're hungry, it's the right thing to do is to eat. But they don't have a morality to say, well, maybe I shouldn't eat somebody else. You know, it's they do what they got to do. But we humans, we check our animal side, which is our physical urges and our emotional desires. Maybe we can check that by reason and referencing prescribed or agreed to, that we've made a deliberate choice to agree to, precepts that we're going to run our decision-making processes through when times get tough. This is what makes the difference for us versus the animals, I would say, or the rest of the animals, because of course we are animals who have evolved somehow to be able to be human. So what happens when we have precepts, when we live morally? First of all, we can have a more fulfilling life, because we get this fulfilling sense that we've done the right thing when we live according to the precepts. And conversely, we get to feel like shit if we don't. And we know, but our conscience is telling us, you've bypassed. And most people have a sort of an internal compass, which is really easy to, because most people understand that it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to rape, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to lie, and all these sorts of things. Most people understand that very inherently. So to build up precepts around that is actually a fairly simple human concept, I would say. So conversely, when we go against those precepts, we get to feel kind of shitty about it, unless we have a very poorly developed empathetic side, perhaps, and we're completely psychopath, in which case we're not really, to the extent that that is true, we're not as human as we could be. Because now we're operating very similar to a cat that will just play with a gopher that's alive because it's fun while it's killing it. You know, like a cat will just play with it, they'll throw it up in the air, and they won't kill it right away, they're just going to have fun with it for a while. That is not a human trait. We wouldn't just torture somebody just unless we're completely psychopaths, in which case we're more like a cat in that respect. So if we say we're running on principles, and we say that some things are right and some things are wrong, and yet we violate those, we then have created our sort of moral equivalent of shit soup. Because we've said that we are going to live a certain way, and yet we decide to ignore that said decision in certain incidents for expedient purposes or whatever. A good example would be taking the proceeds of taxation, right? Taking the proceeds of taxation when there is a possible choice would be saying, okay, I'm gonna say to myself that I disagree with theft, but I'm going to take the proceeds of theft, and that's okay. Well, the problem is this has a way of corrupting our life in other ways. And I see this with people in discussion, and I see that in myself at times too, that when this is brought up, there's all this backpedaling that goes on, and you can see the nature of how allowing corruption in one moral category to slip in, it will then spread elsewhere, and there'll be all this defense of things that are going on, this defensive dance. Oh, what are you going to do about the schools, man? What are you going to do about the roads, man? It's all this defensive strategy that starts going on, and that's an example of moral corruption. If there wasn't moral corruption, it would be like, oh shit, I didn't notice that. You see, now that is coming back, because some people may not have thought about it, in which case when it's brought up, somebody who's running off of a precept that says, I'm going to be intellectually honest, would say, shit, I never thought about that. Holy fuck. What am I going to do about that? Like it's like one of those aha moments. But people who go right into the defense of it right away, they've thought about it. But they're willing to keep that corruption in there for the comfort of the moment. And I forget who was once said that those who would seek comfort for freedom deserve neither. And to me, the height or the high expression of freedom is intellectual honesty. And without that intellectual honesty, I don't think we can really have a functional operation upon precepts. Because precepts, well, first of all, it's consistency. It's consistency to universals. When we have those precepts in place, we're going to say, this precept applies to me, and it might as well apply to everybody else. At least that would be optimal if they're very, very universals. And they're all in thou shalt nots, basically. They're prohibitions. I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this. Because it's easier to say you're not going to do something than you're going to do it. Like if I was going to say I have to be charitable, that would mean that every moment that I was not charitable, I would be violating my precept. Whereas if I say that I shall not steal, that's possibly universal, because that means that every moment that I'm not stealing, I'm virtuous. But if I was to say I must be, if it was a positive precept that says I have to be charitable, then I could be charitable in this moment. But if I'm not charitable while I'm sleeping at night, I'm like I'm evil, or I'm not virtuous in that moment. So it's not actually possible to have positive precepts and to be able to actually comply with them. That's why you'll see that all of the major traditions of precepts are all in the form of prohibitions, right? So anyways, coming right back to it, as I would say that the real shit soup, the real even small morsel of shit in the soup are those gaps in intellectual honesty based on precepts. Because as soon as we allow that in consciously, and we're okay with it, and we gloss it over, then we allow the shit to spread throughout and contaminate and corrupt our the rest of our intellectual and our moral fabric. And this is not good for even just a practical for our quality of life, because if we're aware of it, it's going to gnaw on us, and we turn into really neurotic characters after a while, I think, who are just going to try to justify ever increasing amounts of corruption. Because after all, that shit in there is going to fester eventually. And even if we don't eat it and decided to put it aside, it's going to turn into something really horrid that we're going to have to somehow bury, because it's actually going to stink later on. So I like to use metaphors anyways, because I know it's a little bit graphic and a little bit disgusting in a way. But hey, if it's worth talking about and there's value that can come from it, might as well go there. Steve here again, great chatting, talking about all things shit soup. Talk again later. Bye for now.